Alright, welcome everybody to the Lorwyn Eclipsed State of the Format address. This is your one-stop shop for understanding what's going on in this limited format and being able to win a little bit more, at least in my humble opinion anyways. So yeah, I've really enjoyed this format. It's been right up there with my fave format of last year, Final Fantasy. Admittedly, part of this is that I've been doing pretty well in this format. I have not yet not trophied. So every single of my drafts have been a trophy so far. So that always influences how much you like a format. But even still, I think even if I wasn't winning as much, lots of good stuff to talk about in this format. Lots of exciting things happening. If this is your first time here, welcome. My name's Alex. On this channel, we talk a lot about just the current limited format and generally how to get better at limited magic. So if that's your jam, stick around, maybe hit that subscribe button. But for today, just going to talk about Lorwyn, talk about everything I know about the draft format, talk about things that I think are important to know for your next draft. Let's just jump in. No better place to start, I think, than just talking about the 5 creature type decks, kind of the 5 on-brand decks, as it were, right? There's 5 on-brand decks that care about the creature types, so Elf, Kithkin, Merfolk, Elemental, Goblin, and then there's the weird other 5 decks of the format, kind of the off-brand decks that don't actually have a gold card, don't really have a creature type associated with them. I mean, there's a little bit of association, but not generally what those decks are about. We're going to focus on the 5 on-brand decks first and talk about the 5 off-brand decks a little bit later. And with these 5 decks, I'm happy to say that I think almost all of them hit the mark on, yeah, this is a functional, good deck. Like, if this deck is open, you should draft this deck. I say almost all of them because there's one deck, Red-Black Goblins, that I don't think is bad. If you look on 17 lands right now, actually, I'll tell you, this deck is bad, you shouldn't draft it. I think this deck just needs some specific pieces, is a little bit difficult to both draft and play, and ultimately is probably a little bit weaker than the other 4 decks, but I wouldn't write it off. It's not the kind of deck that's like, well, you shouldn't draft this even if it's open. If Goblins is open, you should draft it. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. The important thing here is that the other 4 decks, Elves, Kithkin, Merfolk, Elementals, they're all good decks. They've felt good to me. They've played well for me. If you're not winning at the rate that you would like to in this format, I think an easy path to success is just try to identify which of these 4 decks is most open in your seat, draft that, and that'll get you like 80% of the way there, at least at this point in the format. Now, one problem with this is I'm framing this as just like, oh, if you're not doing well, just draft the open seed and you'll do fine. You'll find whatever deck is open. That's actually really difficult in this format. I know through talking to people on my Discord, people I coach, people on my Twitch stream, a big challenge for a lot of people has been draft navigation in this format and just figuring out how to get into the open lane and when to give up a good start that you had because you realize some other deck is open, right? You started Merfolk, Elemental stuff is wide open, Merfolk stuff, okay, you're getting some cards, but not quite the cards you want. Should you jump ship, right? That's really challenging. So a lot of what I'm going to cover today is going to be focused on draft navigation. If that's you, if you're like, hey, yeah, I found the drafts really challenging, don't worry. We're going to talk about later. I do want to cover these 5 decks first, though, and just what they're doing, outline them. I think it really helps when we get into the draft navigation portion. So let's start with Elves, which I think is one of the best decks in the format, if not the best. I hesitate to call it the best because that means the racists win, but Elves just has so much good stuff going for it. I would broadly think about this deck as a good mid-range deck, and when I say a good mid-range deck, I mean a mid-range deck that has the ability to beat down, but it can also grind in the late game, right? Can pressure early, can run you over, but also doesn't run out of gas, has things to spend its mana on, and I think in general, that's a really good place to be in this format. So a big picture thought is that this is not a format where you can get by with just putting a bunch of 2-drops in your deck and that's it, right? Just the more cheap cards you have, the better. A lot of the cheap cards in this format get outclassed relatively quickly. And so this is a format where you need to be building up the curve. You need to have enough 3s and 4s and 5s. You need to have some card advantage, some grinding tools. You also need your cheap cards to be good, right? This isn't an excuse for your cheap cards either to be weak. And this isn't an excuse to not have enough cheap cards. I'm still looking for like 8 or 9 cheap cards if I can get them. I'm just saying that in Avatar, to contrast this, I looked at a lot of my trophy decks in Avatar, and it's just like, yep, super lean curve, lots of 2s. Sure, you had some 3s and a couple 4s and 5s, but really it was about tempo, it was about the cheap cards. This format is not so much about that. The cheap cards don't convert into a win quite as easily. You want to be building up the curve. You want to have some grind. You want to have some card advantage. You want to be able to compete into turns 6, 7, 8. Bringing this all back around to Elves, Elves does this extremely well. It's got the late game stuff. It's got the grind. And its cheap cards are good as well. For each of the archetypes we talk about today, I'll of course show an example deck, one that I've drafted in most cases. The example deck here, I gotta say, this is more of a brag than anything else. This is not gonna be your average card quality elf deck. My deck here is pretty busted. I picked up 4 copies of Eclipsed Elf. That's the hybrid uncommon that when it enters, you look for an elf, swamp, or forest, put into your hand. I've got 2 copies of Morkant's Loyalist. That's the gold card that pumps your elves. Honestly, the longer you look at this deck, the sillier it gets. I've got a bunch of good elf rares kind of hiding out in here too. But I don't have a worse elf deck to show you, unfortunately, so you're just going to have to bear with me. All right, some specifics now. Talking about the cards you're going to want to keep an eye out for, the cards that are good to take early, the cards you'll want for this deck. And we're going to start, as we're going to with pretty much all of these creature type decks, we're going to start with the Eclipsed card in the cycle, Eclipsed Elf. So again, this is the hybrid Golgari card. It's a 3/2. When it enters, you look at the top 4, you take an elf, swamp, or forest, put into your hand. I know a lot of people watching know that this card and all the cards in the cycle are good, but I want to give a PSA that I think these cards are better than a lot of people think, even though people like them. They're good cards. They get drafted highly. These Eclipse cards are as good as a rare for the decks that they go in, right? They're just so good for your consistency, not only in hitting your land drops, which I do grab lands off these quite often, you know, just being able to get to land 4, 5, 6, being able to keep a 2-lander very comfortably with one of these Eclipse cards in hand, especially if it's the Kithkin, because that one's 2 mana, right? They just add so much to the consistency of your deck, plus not just hitting your lands, which is a big part of these cards, but being able to find your best cards, see your rares a little more often. I think if you're not treating these right now as good first picks and cards that will pull you into their archetype, you should. The other uncommon I like just about as much as Eclipsed Elf, and this is really high praise, right? Because I'm just going on about how good the Eclipse cards are. Morkant's Loyalist is the 1 black-green 3/2 elf. Other elves you control get +1/+1. When this dies, return another elf card from your graveyard to your hand. It's such a sick design, by the way. Like, these Lord effects, these cards that pump your other creatures, you want to kill them on sight. Your opponent plays them, you go, yep, I gotta kill this, and you get punished for killing this one. So yeah, really, really strong card. I think they really nailed the gold uncommons for this set too. You're gonna see kind of a pattern for all the decks we talk about where it's like, yep, Eclipse card really good and gold card really good. Just below those, we have 2 really nice ones. So Morkant's Eyes is a 2-mana green Kindred Enchantment elf. So it counts as an elf. At the beginning of your upkeep, surveil 1. You can pay 4 green, sacrifice this enchantment, create X 2/2 black and green elf tokens, where X is the number of elf cards in your graveyard, activate only as a sorcery. So I haven't explicitly called it out, but, you know, for anybody who's played the set or knows anything about the set, elves do have a bit of a graveyard theme. It's not exactly the kind of graveyard theme where it's like, I'm just going to dump all my cards in the graveyard and, you know, I can play with all these effects in the graveyard. It's more like, okay, my creatures trade off. They make their way to the graveyard. There are cards like Morkant's Eyes that reward you for that. There are some cards that say, oh, do you have 1 elf in the graveyard? If you do, you get my effect, right? So it's more of an incidental thing. But Morkant's Eyes is one of the best reasons to care a little bit more about the graveyard. So if I have Morkant's Eyes, I might prioritize Midnight Tilling a little bit higher, or I might play 2 copies of this card in my deck where I might only play 1. This is the 1 in a green instant at common, mill 4 cards, then you can turn a permanent from among them to your hand. We'll talk a little bit more about this card after. But yeah, Eyes is just a great card. Notably, it does count itself, right? It is an elf. So whatever number Arena shows you on the card and when you go to sack it, it's actually that +1, right? So if you've got 2 elves in the grave, this is going to make 3 tokens. And sometimes that's enough, right? 3 tokens for 6 mana, or like, you know, I guess 8 overall. Sometimes that's going to be enough. You get some elf triggers. Maybe you've got a Morkant's Loyalist in the battlefield. It pumps your elves. Those are 3 tokens. Okay, sweet. But a lot of the time, I just go, hey, you know, I've done some early damage. Maybe I've gotten the opponent down to 10. This Eyes just keeps taking up and up and up. In a few turns, I'm going to make like 8 tokens and just kill you. Just go so wide, there's no way you can possibly survive. Or, you know, if you need them to block, they're extremely good blockers too. That's one of the things about this elf deck. Plays aggro, plays defense, grinds if it needs to. Another great uncommon for this deck is Moon Vigil Adherence. This is 2 green for a 0/0. It's an elf, of course. Has trample and says this creature gets +1/+1 for each creature you control and each creature card in your graveyard. This thing is so scary. It's not uncommon to see this as like an 11/11, a 12/12, obviously not on turn 4, but as the game goes on, just this is a must kill. Notably here, and I'm sure some of you are thinking this already, this is the kind of card that I generally dislike. You know, if you've watched any of my content before, if you've watched the set review of the set, creatures that cost more than 3 mana and don't have an enter the battlefield effect or protection, you know, ward, hexproof, anything like that, those always play out worse than they look, because when you play one of these on turn 4, turn 5, whatever it is, your opponent kills it with a 2-mana removal spell or a 1-mana removal spell. that is a huge tempo loss, and that can be game losing on the spot, right? That's still all true. That dynamic still exists, but they've done a really good job in this set, and this is not the only card that's like this. There's actually a few cards that we'll point out as we go on today that are like this. They've done a good job of making these big dummies worth it. The risk is worth the reward. Yes, sucks when they die to a Blossom Bind or whatever, but if they do survive, if you get to untap with them, they're gonna really go off. So yeah, I really love that, by the way. As much as I think it is a accurate card evaluation tool to say, hey, these kind of creatures are worse than they look, I like that they've gotten to a point in designing them where they've juiced them enough where it's like, I want to play this card. I'm willing to play this card. I hate having to be like, yeah, these cards suck, don't play them. No enter the battlefield effect, no protection, like we just write them off. No, I really love that they found a sweet spot for those. And like I said, a lot of cards like that in this set, I'll call them out when we get to them. Moving right along now, we've got Lizelana Dignitary, 1 and a green for a 2/3 elf. As an additional cost to cast it, you either pay 2 or behold an elf, and you can tap to add green, activate only if there is another elf in your graveyard. So yeah, generally just a pretty strong card. With this behold cycle, there's like a cycle at uncommon, 1 for each of the creature type decks. I think you're looking for like 8 or 9 of the creature type to consistently cast them early. And that's really easy if you've just got like the sicko elf deck. You know, the deck that I showed you, that's going to be no problem at all. But not all of your decks are going to go that hard on one creature type. I think Elves is actually a little more likely than not to end up there. But I know for blue-white, that's a deck where sometimes you care about the Merfolk, absolutely. And sometimes you're just like, hey, I care a little bit more about Convoking, maybe. Or you have a rare that brings you in an interesting direction. And you don't automatically end up with that many of that creature type. So just a little bit of a PSA out there. For what it's worth, also, I don't think a successful deck in this format needs to be literally all the same creature type. I've had success with decks that aren't just going super hard on the creature type. But yeah, if you are in that spot where you're not just like the sicko deck, 8 or 9 at a minimum for these kind of cards. Another great uncommon here, Virulent Emissary, single green mana for a 1/1 Death Touch elf. Whenever another creature you control enters, gain a life. This is a card I've noticed has been going a little bit under the radar, a little bit underrated early on, but it's just great, right? Just trades anything, gains you a bunch of life, buy it back from the yard when it trades off. Yeah, not a lot to dislike about this card. Nameless Inversion, one of my favorite cards in the set. This is a reprint from original Lorwyn, but I just think it's so cool. So this is the 1 in a black Kindred instant shapeshifter. So it is a changeling. It counts as all your creature types. And says target creature gets +3, -3, and loses all creature types until the end of turn. I think this card's probably at its best in black-green because you can buy it back with your Morkant's Loyalist when it dies, right? The green-black Elf Lord. That's pretty sweet. It counts as an elf in the graveyard for your Morkant's eyes, right? So, you know, you can always find this off of an Eclipse creature. That's true for any deck. But I think you get even more of a something-something with this in black-green. So yeah, just kind of a cool interaction. One of the biggest surprises to me in this set, a card that in the set review, if you watch that, we rated this really, really low. And I think it's just really good. Just like might be the biggest miss of the whole set review. Gathering Stone. This is the 4 mana artifact at uncommon that says when it enters, you choose a creature type. Spells you cast the chosen type cost 1 less to cast. And when this artifact enters and at the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top card of your library. If it's a card of that type, you can put it into your hand. And if you don't, you can put that thing into your graveyard. Yeah, so with this set being a little bit slower than Avatar, you know, for example, or some of the recent sets, a tick slower, this is the kind of card that really excels. You know, I mentioned you wanted some card advantage, you want ways to grind, and this is a really good way of doing it, right? You've got to have the right deck for it. You've got to have something in the neighborhood of like 12 creatures with the same creature type. But yeah, if you're there, like every time I see this card on the battlefield on my opponent's side, I go, oh, I have to end the game. I just have to end the game. This thing's going to take over if I don't. When I play it, I feel great about it. I'm just like, oh, great. Like, this game's going nowhere quickly. I'm going to be up a bunch of cards and mana in a few turns. I'm putting it in the Elf section here because I think Elves is one of the better decks for this card. I mean, you can put this in Goblins. You can put this in Merfolk. You can put this in, maybe not Kithkin. Kithkin really just wants to beat down. And Elementals don't always have actually a ton of Elementals, but Goblin, Merfolk, and Elves. 3 decks that are playing a little bit more of a mid-rangey or long game and often have a ton of their creature type. Really great in those decks. One of the other things that makes Elves a good deck is basically all of the common Elves are just pretty good cards. Like, there's a clunker or 2 in there. There's like the 3 mana 4/2 Flash Elf. That card, not unplayable or anything, but it's not exciting. But most of the commons are cards I'm just like, yeah, that's a pretty darn good card. So we've got 2 good 2-drops, Lieselana Informant, that's the 3-1 that when it enters or dies, surveil 1. Scarblade Scout, that's the 2-mana 2/2 lifelink that mills 2 cards when it enters. 2 4-drops that I want to call out that I think are pretty underrated. Dawnhand Eulogist. This card's great. Like, this is the premier common for this deck. I think currently, right now, in 17 lands, it's actually sitting as the top common in the set for what it's worth. And I see this card going super late. So this is a 4-mana 3/3 in black. It's an elf, has menace. When it enters, you mill 3 cards, and if there's an elf card in your graveyard, each opponent loses 2 life, and you gain 2 life. So, like, 4-mana 3/3 menace, drain 2, that's great. Like, that is a good rate for a card. And add a relevant creature type, buffs it up a little bit. That self-mill buffs it up a little bit. Adds it to a package of just like a really rock-solid card. Another one, Safe Right Cavalry. This is the 4-mana 4/4 in green. Can't be blocked by more than one creature, and you can pay 5 to have target elf you control get +2/+2 until end of turn. This is another card that is 4 mana and doesn't have protection or an enter the battlefield effect, and yet I think it's pretty good. This thing is so difficult to block, right? It's just like almost impossible to deal with profitably in combat. You really need to have like a death touch creature. We also have a few spells that I like playing in this deck aside from my removal spells. So Scarblade's Malice is the single black mana instant. Target creature you control gets death touch and lifelink until end of turn, and when that creature dies this turn, create a 2/2 black elf token. So this is a way to have your cheap cards interact profitably with some of the more expensive cards. You know, I mentioned that the 2-drops in the set, they get outclassed, or they outstay their welcome pretty often. This is a way to convert those cheap cards into something that's actually relevant as the game goes on. It also plays pretty nicely with Dawnhand Eulogist, so that's the black menace creature, giving death touch to your menace creature after they double block. You know, it's kind of just a nice natural synergy. And then Midnight Tilling. So this is the 2-mana instant mill 4, take a permanent from among them, put it into your hand. Yeah, this is a card I'm pretty happy to play a copy of in basically any elf deck. Just a little bit of card selection, a little bit of filtering, and I'll play multiple copies. 2, sometimes 3. I think 2 is kind of the sweet spot, though. 2, when you've got either A, some busted cards to dig to, so you've got some of the better rares that you could pick up for this deck, or B, you've got enough cards that really, really care about the graveyard, and in a scaling way, right? So when I say care about the graveyard, I'm not talking about Dawnhand Eulogist, because you only need 1 elf in your graveyard for this to work. That's going to be pretty easy. That's going to happen most games. I don't need to put a card in my deck that mills to enable it. But when you're talking something like Morkant's Eyes, the 2-mana enchantment, or the Adherence, the giant trampler, that's when I'm like, okay, if I have cards that really get better the more and more cards in my graveyard, that's where I want to play a Midnight Tilling. Again, maybe the second copy. I could see a third one, but I haven't been there yet. The last card I want to talk about is Moonglove Extractor, and I would classify this as a little bit of a trap. So this is the 2 and a black 2/1 elf that when it attacks, you draw a card, lose a life. It's not a trap in the sense that people think it's busted and an awesome common, and you know, people are just like shoving a bunch of copies into their deck, drafting it highly. I don't think people think of it as that card. I think people are just like a little bit too willing to have this card be their 20 to 23rd card in their deck, right? The last few cards filling out their slots. It's not an unplayable card by any means, but I've done a lot of deck techs this week where there's a lot of better cards in the sideboard and they have like 2 copies of this Extractor. It's just a little too dorky, you know, 3 mana, 2/1. It doesn't have a clean attack very often. It gets a little bit better if you've got multiple copies of Scarblade's Malice. That's the black trick. But in general, I would play a lot of the other elves before I play this one. Next up, we've got Blue-White Merfolk. This is the deck that I have personally drafted the most so far. Not because I like it any better than the other good decks in the format, just I've kind of ended up there. And I think it's a really flexible deck to draft. So Merfolk's whole thing, aside from just caring about Merfolk, is it has Convoke cards, right? You want to play a lot of cheap creatures, a lot of cards that say, when I become tapped, I do a thing. Token makers, if you can find them, to enable your expensive Convoke cards, right? And there was this question I had, and I know a lot of other people had before playing the set. Is Merfolk going to be mostly aggressive, where it's like, yeah, you just want to dump your hand, Convoke out stuff very quickly, just kind of like, almost like Boros Convoke, for those who know that standard deck that existed like a year or 2 ago at this point. Kind of like that. Or is it more, play some creatures, sit back, gain some life, loot a little bit, draw some cards, win eventually. I think the nice thing about Blue-White is it can kind of just do both. It's very similar to the Elf deck, where if you've got a good curve, you know, you just go Wanderbrine Trapper on turn 1, which is an awesome card. This is the single white mana 2/1 Merfolk that you can pay 1 to tap it, tap another creature you control, tap target creature an opponent controls. You go this into any 2-drop, into a 3-drop, into a removal spell, and like, yeah, that's a good beatdown. Your opponent's probably going to be a bit behind. But you also have draws where you're like, all right, I play a 2-on-2, 3-on-3, I don't have great attacks, but then I cast my Unexpected Assistance, the Convoke spell that draws 3 cards, and discard a card. I've tapped my Wanderbrine Preacher, that's the 2-mana 2/2. When it becomes tapped, you gain 2 life, so you get a little bit of value there. I just build it a board, build it a board, build it a board, and eventually I can overwhelm you. Either by just having more creatures, or by overpowering you by just casting a lot of impactful Convoke spells. I want to use Merfolk, and actually the deck I have in front of me, as a little bit of a sidebar to talk about synergy in this set. So, this set is a very synergistic set, right? Like, it's all about synergy. Contrast this to Avatar, where, sure, there's synergies. But a lot of the time, I felt like you could just be like, take the best card out of the pack of my colors, and you're going to draft a pretty good deck. I think a lot of the skill in this format, and doing really well in this format, comes down to knowing what your deck wants, identifying your payoffs, identifying what enables those payoffs, and generally just, in a synergistic set, you think about this a lot, when will I take a worse card, quote unquote, over a better card to make my synergies work? If you're somebody who looks at 17 lands win rate data for individual cards, I think this is especially important, because the less synergistic a set is, the more reliably you can just draft based on win rate data. Which is to say, like, if you just used the 17 lands game in hand win rate as kind of a rough pick order, you wouldn't be drafting optimally, but you wouldn't be all that far off. In this set, I think it's a really bad idea to use 17 lands just as that rough pick order. I mean, as is always the case, the good cards are the good cards. There's no hiding that, there's no obscuring that. You can be pretty safe if you see a B+ level card, you should take that card. But the opposite side of things, where you're looking at the bad cards, so like the C- and below cards, those cards are going to be way more contextual in this set than they would be in a more simple set. Something like a Foundations, or even like a notch below this in Avatar, for example. And I'm using Merfolk blue-white as an example, because what I found so far in this deck is sometimes I really care about the Merfolk side of things, right? Sometimes I have 2 of the gold card, the Lord that pumps in your Merfolk, and I've got a good Merfolk rare, maybe I've got an Eclipsed Marrow in there, and I go, yeah, I want to take kind of a middling Merfolk common, something like the Silvergill Peddler, 3 mana, 2/3 Merfolk. When it becomes tapped, draw a card, discard a card. I actually kind of like this card. I don't want to put too much shade on it, but I'm just picking out a kind of unassuming card. I will take this card because it says Merfolk on it, sometimes over a slightly better card, over a solid removal spell, or over a creature that's not a Merfolk that is generically a little better. But the deck I have in front of me, if you'll notice, I actually don't have cards that really care about Merfolk. I mean, I've got the Eclipsed Marrow, and, a card gets better for sure if you've got Merfolk to grab, and I do have Merfolk in the deck. I've also got Wanderwine Farewell, which is the 7 mana blue Convoke Kindred Merfolk sorcery. You bounce 2 things and get 2 Merfolk. But really, this deck doesn't have that much of a Merfolk theme. And because I don't have a bunch of cards to say, hey, I really want Merfolk, I'm not going to take a worse card, a worse Merfolk, over a better card just because I'm in blue-white. And that might sound obvious, but I've already looked at a lot of draft logs where the person, let's say for example, did first pick a card that cares about Merfolk, so Eclipsed Marrow. And then, they go through the draft, maybe by pack 2, pack 3, they're in blue-white still, but they haven't actually picked up more cards that say, hey, I really want you to play Merfolk. And they are taking Merfolk that are weaker cards over better cards as a concession to like 1 or maybe 2 payoffs that pay you off for that creature type. So yeah, just something to be aware of. I guess to give you a decent baseline, I think you need like 3 or 4, something in the neighborhood, really good payoffs before I start taking lesser cards of a certain type over just generically stronger cards. And when I say good payoffs, I mean rares and good uncommons. I'm not just talking about like a medium uncommon or a common that asks you to have that creature type. I'm talking like a gold signpost uncommon plus 2 rares that like that creature type. All right, on to some individual cards now. So like I said before, big surprise here, we've got the gold card and the Eclipse card as kind of the standout uncommons. So the gold card here, Deep Channel Duelist, white, blue for a 2/2 Merfolk. At the beginning of your end step, untap target Merfolk you control, and that's burying the lead a bit because the next line of text is other Merfolk you control get +1/+1. Yeah, this card's awesome. Extremely good payoff. This is kind of funny. There's a rare that's also like a 2-mana gold card that it's like a has flash, it untaps all your Merfolk, and when 3 or more Merfolk attack, your creatures get +1/+0. I think this Duelist, the uncommon, is actually just better than the rare, for what it's worth, if you ever have that pick. Excellent card. Eclipsed Marrow, 3 mana, 2/3, does all the things the Eclipse cards do. Also excellent card. Very happy, once again, to first pick these uncommons. Some other great ones. Wonderbrine Trapper. I talked about this one a second ago. This is the single white mana 2/1 that you can pay 1 tap another untapped creature you control, tap target creature an opponent controls. 1 mana 2/1 isn't quite enough these days to just be like, yeah, that's a great card. But creature type, of course, matters here, and that tap ability to be relevant in the late game. I've been saying it over and over again, but any way to make your cheap cards relevant in the late game is something that you really appreciate in this set. Silvergill Mentor, another kind of obvious one, but very good in this deck. This is the 2 mana 2/1 that you must behold a Merfolk or pay 2, and when it enters, you make a 1/1 token, so awesome for getting your Convoke going. I like Wonderbrine Preacher, the 2 mana 2/2 in white that taps to gain 2 life. Silvergill Peddler, the 3 mana blue creature, 2/3, taps to draw a card, then discard a card. And then the other side of the equation here is you've got your Convoke cards, and I think pretty much all of the Convoke cards are playable to good. Like, I'm not too picky about them. Obviously, some I like better than others, but most of the Convoke cards, like, if it says Convoke, it's probably just a pretty good card. One I really like is Omni Changeling. 3 blue for a 0/0 shapeshifter, Changeling, of course, has Convoke, and it's a clone, so it enters the battlefield as a copy of anything, not just your stuff, your opponent's stuff, too. This card's really impressed me. So, generally, clones are kind of just okay, right? Like, 4 mana clone, the OG card, is not a card that I'm excited about in Limited these days. You add Convoke onto the card, even though you're adding additional mana. You add Convoke, and I think that really changes things. And that's just true, as like it's just a general statement, right? Convoke is a great limited mechanic. Anything you see that has Convoke probably is a little bit better than it reads. This is also a set with a lot of great enter the battlefield effects, so clone gets a little bit better. Also, if you want to think about it this way, this is kind of just like a synergy amplifier. So the more synergistic your deck is, the more it cares about Merfolk, the more that the clone effect is going to benefit you. Because, you might have a Deep Channel Duelist on the battlefield, for example. Maybe you have multiple copies of that in your deck. And be able to clone that rather than just like, whatever your generic best creature is in some other deck at any given time. That's really, really impactful, being able to get that clone effect. Some other Convoke cards here. Temporal Cleansing, the blue sorcerer removal spell. Good card. Unexpected Assistance, the card draw spell, like I mentioned, I like a copy or two of that. Marrow Sky Swimmer, the flying vigilant Merfolk that comes in with the token. I even like Sundappled Celebrant a decent amount. This is the 4 white 5/6 Convoke Vigilance. That doesn't have any more text, it's just that, but it's massive. This thing is just huge, right? 5/6 Vigilance. The creatures in this set are fairly small. So yeah, this thing is often a problem when it comes down. Klacken Festival is a Kithkin card, but kind of secretly a Merfolk card in a lot of ways. So this is the 2 white Kindred Enchantment Kithkin at uncommon. When it enters, you make 2 Kithkin tokens, and you can pay 5 mana to make a 1/1 Kithkin token. And this is what I'm talking about when I say you really have to know what your deck cares about. Because if you're the deck that is all about Merfolk, and you've got all the lords, you've got good Merfolk rares that want other Merfolk, and you don't have like that many Convoke cards in your deck, this card's not going to be very good. If you look on 17 lands, it's actually one of the better cards in Merfolk. It's performing at like a C+ on average, but you don't just put this in your deck without a bunch of Convoke cards. And the more Convoke cards you have in your deck, the better this kind of effect is going to get. I might take this over a Merfolk payoff. Not one of the better ones, of course, but over kind of like one of the fine ones if my deck doesn't care that much about Merfolk or has a lot of Convoke cards. Those are the kind of tricky picks that I think are going to make this format pretty interesting. All right, next deck up is Kithkin, green and white Kithkin. And this might be the most straightforward deck out of the 5 creature decks. It's pretty... I don't want to say brain dead, that's a little bit derogatory to these Kithkin. I know they've been through a lot with all these elves, being prejudiced against them. But it is a little bit just like, you just want creatures that attack and block, creatures that can push damage, and that's kind of the formula. Maybe I'm glossing over some nuance here, but I do think out of all 5 creature decks, this is the most straightforward. I guess something interesting to say about the Kithkin deck is it kind of wants to play a little bit of a different game than the other decks, where the other decks, I think you are concerned about being able to play well into turn 5, 6, 7. I think the Kithkin deck is a tried and true aggro deck that just wants to get the game over with. You're just looking for well-statted creatures, ways to push those creatures through. The Kithkin deck just can't really compete with what a black-green or a blue-white deck is doing in the late game. But to make up for that, it is very, very good in the early game. Like, I think some of the most busted starts, some of the starts that just, like, you know, nobody's ever beating, come from the Kithkin deck over any other deck. So as often is the case with a good aggro deck, you're trading a little bit of resiliency for some explosiveness. Okay, now getting to some individual Kithkin cards. What a surprise! Nobody could have guessed that the two best uncommons here are the gold card and the Eclipsed card. So Thought-With Lieutenant is the gold card, real banger. Green-white for a 2/2 Kithkin. When it or another Kithkin enters, target creature you control gets +1/+1 and gains trample until end of turn. Just responsible for so much damage. And Eclipse Kithkin, 2-mana hybrid, 2/1, does the Eclipse card thing. One thing you do really have to keep in mind when drafting the Kithkin deck, because it is pretty easy for the cheap cards to get blanked in this format, and that includes the cards in this deck, at least the non-premium ones, or, you know, Thought-With Lieutenant, that thing's not getting blanked very easily. But to, like, the common 2-drops, they do get blanked pretty easily. You really have to make sure your Kithkin deck has enough cards that are good at pushing damage. Either they're very well statted, just the creature itself is just a great creature, or they're like the Thought-With Lieutenant, which helps your other creatures get in. The more just like random bodies you have, like 2-mana 2/2s, 3-mana 3/3s, the easier it is for your deck just to get stalled out and kind of cross a point of no return, where, you know, the Kithkin deck does not have very good tools for reach in the late game. Or you get your opponent down to 8, it's not very likely that you're going to be able to kill them if they stabilize, if you don't have attacks for a turn or two. So aside from Thought-With Lieutenant, which does that pretty well, we've got the Behold card, the Kithkin Behold card, which is Kinsbale Aspirant, single white mana for a 2/1. As an initial cost, you gotta Behold a Kithkin or pay 2. Whenever another creature you control enters, this creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. I know during the set review, Mark brought up the curve of Kinsbale Aspirant into Thought-With Lieutenant, the gold card, into Klacken Festival, which is the 3-mana enchantment that makes 2 1/1 tokens. And yeah, just like nobody's ever beating that curve, right? You're attacking for 3 on turn 2 into what, like, I don't know, I don't even know the math right here, but it's like 6 or 7 on turn 3 or something like that. You can definitely have some absurd curve outs in this deck. Past that, 2 really good 4-drops here. Another card that bucks the trend is good enough, even though it doesn't have a enter the battlefield effect or protection. Is just good enough when you untap with it. Bristlebane Outrider is 3 and a green for a 3/5 Kithkin Knight. It can't be blocked by creatures power 2 or less, and as long as another creature enters the battlefield under your control this turn, this creature gets +2/+0. So just basically a 5/5 that's not unblockable, but fairly close to unblockable, or at very least puts your opponent in a spot where they're often going to have to chump. Another great card for pushing damage, Thought-With Imbuer, 3 and a white for an 0/5 Kithkin. Whenever a creature you control attacks alone, it gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of Kithkin you control. So this is one of the few cards that is very good in a stalled out board in this deck. You know, you don't often want to get to that stalled out board position when you're playing Kithkin, but if you are there, the Imbuer can just be like, alright, send in my worst creature. It's a 6/6, deal with it, deal with it, deal with it, while also being good on curve, right? You just go 2-drop into 3-drop into this, your 2-drop now attacks for 5 or something. So yeah, really, really like the Imbuer. I also like Everstrike's Gift quite a bit. This is the single mana aura at uncommon. The enchanted creature gets +1/+0 and has flying, and you can pay 2 and blight 2. Return this card from your graveyard to your hand, activate only as a sorcery. So again, another card that kind of just turns anything into a threat. At the common level, we've got Gallant Foul Knight, which is 3 and a white for a 3/4 Kithkin. When it enters, creatures you control get +1/+0, and Kithkins you control get first strike. Honestly, not a ton of common creatures I like in this deck. This is one of the main ones. I do think Kithkin is a little bit more uncommon reliant than, let's say, Merfolk or Elves. But yeah, Foul Knight is one of the better ones. We've also got Mist Meadow Council, which is 4 and a green for a 4/3 Kithkin, but it only costs 4 mana if you control another Kithkin, and when it enters, you draw a card. Yeah, this card's really nice. Just, you know, 4 mana, 4/3 draw a card. That's just a great rate. If you can enable that, like I play this card a lot in my non-Kithkin decks with Changelings. If you can enable this card, it's just a good card. I do like the 3-drops. Crossroad Watcher is a 3 mana, 3/3 trample in green. That whenever a creature you control enters, this creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. And Wary Farmer, 1 Hybrid Selesnya for a 3/3 Kithkin. At the beginning of your end step, if another creature enters the battlefield under your control, surveil 1. So this is one of the few tools that the Kithkin deck gets to be able to get through lands, find the cards it needs, And you don't want a 3/3 body. Nothing too exciting, but I do like a copy or two. I'll also use this moment talking about Wary Farmer to talk about the hybrid cards. Specifically the 3 mana hybrid cards that are double pipped. So like the Wary Farmer here, one Selesnya. You have to be really careful with these cards in decks that aren't, their deck. So for example, Wary Farmer in Selesnya. If you're putting this in a Merfolk deck, you need to make sure that it's a pretty heavy base white Merfolk deck. You can't be even split down the middle. I think people underestimate how infrequently you cast a double pipped 3-drop on turn 3 if your deck is just split down the middle. It's actually pretty difficult. And most of these hybrid cards are not powerful enough to be like, oh, I'll cast it on turn 5 when I have the mana, or even on turn 4. You want to be able to cast them on curve. So be picky about that. Basically, would be my advice there. 2 elves here, not Kithkins, but cards that are good here. They're just good enough at pushing damage. The Moon Vigil Adherent, so that's the trampler that grows based on the number of creatures you control and creatures in your grave. And Safe Freight Cavalry, that's the 4-mana 4/4 in green that can't be blocked by more than one creature. You can pay 5 to have an elf you control get +2/+2 until end of turn. Yeah, like ideally, if you've got the Kithkin payoffs, almost all your cards are Kithkins. But if you're not as reliant on that, then yeah, I think these cards are pretty good. And then one trap card that I don't think does very much for this deck, Gold Metal Nomad. Single white mana for the 1/2 Kithkin. You pay 1 mana, exile this card from your graveyard, create a 1/1 Kithkin token. Like I said before, you really need all your cards in this deck to be good at pushing damage, be well statted. I love me a 1-drop. I love me a good 1-drop. This, unfortunately, is not a good 1-drop. It just doesn't do what this deck needs it to do. Yes, it is 2 triggers for your Kithkin entering the battlefield kind of cards. That is true. But it's just, that's the epitome of more cute than good, is the way I would put that for this card. I like this more in like a Merfolk deck, for what it's worth, if you do have a lot of Convoke cards, because getting that Convoke train started on 1, yeah, it's kind of appealing. But yeah, not a card that I'm dying to play. I would try not to play it in most of my Kithkin decks. Alright, next up, we've got a really interesting one. Maybe the most interesting out of all these creature type decks. Blue-red Elementals. I think this deck has the most variations on how you might want to draft it. So I've got a deck in front of me here, just straight up blue-red. No funny business, no splashing, no nothing. And you're going to draft this some amount of the time. And you're going to care about the elemental creature type. You're going to care about the elemental theme of casting a spell mana value 4 or greater. You're going to have just like a fine tempo-y deck. Okay, that's one thing you can do. For me personally, though, the more common thing I've done with elementals is have it as a base for the vivid stuff, right? The vivid mechanic that cares about different colors amongst permanents you control. Because all of the vivid creatures, at least almost all of them, are elementals themselves. So all your cards like Eclipsed Flamekin, which I don't need to read this out for you. You know what Eclipsed Flamekin does. Well, maybe you don't know the power and toughness. It's a 1/4 for 3 mana. But Eclipsed Flamekin can grab your Vivid payoff. So something like Shimmer Creep, which is the 4 and a black 3/5 menace that drains based on your Vivid count. The deck in front of me is also splashing Luminalist, which is the green Vivid payoff, 2/4 Death Touch for 4 that comes in, gains life equal to your Vivid count. There's also a third variant of this deck, which I've only really seen once from my opponents. Something closer to like a mono-red elemental deck, where you've got the 1-drop elemental, the Behold card. It's like a 1 mana 2/1 that gives things trample and makes mana. And there's the 2-drop elemental that pumps to give itself +1/+1 menace. Like, there's something going on there. I think, once again, less common than just straight blue-red or splish-splashy vivid blue-red, but maybe something to look out for once in a while. In any case, the interesting thing about drafting blue-red is I think you can kind of fall anywhere on the spectrum of straight-up blue-red or even mono-red if you want to extend the spectrum that far. Straight-up blue-red to super splish-splashy, really care about vivid. And you kind of have to decide as you're drafting how much you want to lean into it. Mostly this is dependent on how open blue and red are. Like if you're just getting a great 2-color deck, okay, I'm probably not going to want to splash. But maybe blue and red aren't that open, but you've picked up some good elemental payoffs early. And then middle of pack 2, you see a Shimmer Creep and you're like, okay, yeah, let me speculate on that. You pick up a little bit of fixing, you see another off-color vivid payoff. Then you start prioritizing hybrid cards that aren't exactly blue-red hybrid cards, so the changelings at common, like the red-green changeling 3-drop, or the blue-green changeling 4-drop. You start to care about those a little bit more, and yeah, a lot of variations. By the way, this draft format, I didn't explicitly say this, I think the drafts are really, really interesting. Maybe we'll talk about this a little more when we get to draft navigation, but I find that every single pick, you kind of have to reevaluate the needs of your deck, what your synergies are, what you're building towards, and yeah, that's just kind of interesting. These creature type formats tend to trend towards being on rails, and I think a lot of people were worried about that. You know, think about Bloomburrow. This is not a Bloomburrow. I think the drafts are much more interesting than that. And yeah, Blue-Red, a great example of that. You're always kind of asking, am I more aggressive? Should I be 2 colors? Do I want to pick up fixing in anticipation of maybe seeing some of these Vivid Elementals? Now, into the Elemental cards, and if you've been paying attention, you might think that I'm going to say the best uncommons for this deck are the Eclipse card and the Gold card. And you would be right, actually. I mean, to be fair, with this archetype, I think there's actually quite a few good uncommons that are close to these ones, but these ones are actually really good, and once again, Twin Flame Travelers, the gold uncommon, which is a known to the battlefield, no protection effect, 4-drop creature, they juiced it enough. It's good enough. So this is the 2 blue-red 3/3 flyer elemental that says, if a triggered ability of another elemental you control triggers, it triggers an additional time, and there are so many awesome enter the battlefield effects with the elemental deck. I mean, all the Vivid cards, of course, but you'll just kind of see as we talk about them, and you can see how it's very, very easy to get a bunch of value off of this very, very scary card. Like, this is a you must kill this when this comes down. If you don't, you're in for a bad time next turn. But yeah, some other awesome ones. Flame Braider. This is the 1 in a red 2/2 elemental that taps at 2 mana of any combination, and you can spend this only to cast elementals or activate elemental abilities. Not hard to see why this card is good. It's an absurdly powerful mana dork. You can cast a 5-drop on turn 3. This helps you splash the Vivid Elementals. Just every game you want to start with this card on 2. Rhymekin Recluse, awesome card in general. You know, this is not an elemental specific card. This is the 3 mana 3/2 in blue. Elemental, when it enters, return up to 1 target creature to its owner's hand. So yeah, just generically good card. And Shine Striker, also generically good card. This is 4 blue for a 3/3 elemental flyer. Vivid, when it enters, you draw cards equal to the number of colors amongst permanents you control. So, good time probably just to talk about the Vivid cards in general. I'll bring a few more over here so we can talk about them and kind of cozy up to us here. Luminalisk and Shimmer Creep. I don't know if you'd want to cozy up to these guys. Maybe the Luminalisk. He looks kind of cute, if not a little bit goopy. But anyways, but yeah, the nice thing about the Vivid cards and why it's generally okay to speculate on them early is most of them are passable if Vivid equals 2, right? So if you're just casting these in a 2-color deck, Shimmer Creep, 5 mana, 3/5 menace, drain for 2. Okay, that's a little bit below where you'd want, but it's also passable, it's acceptable. Same thing with Luminalisk, gaining 2 life, that's acceptable, passable. You can really optimize on them if you're going for the Vivid deck. You know, getting these to 4 or 5 are great, but almost all of the Vivid cards, I'm kind of okay with the count being 2, while still striving for more if you can. And Shine Striker, probably the most okay out of all of them. Like, if this is a 6 mana 3/3 draw 2 cards, you're pretty happy about that. When you draw a 3rd card off of it, it feels pretty absurd, and, you know, any more than that, your opponent's just scooping it up, basically. So yeah, Shine Striker, excellent in this deck, but also just pretty good as a blue card. I'm very happy playing this in my Merfolk deck, for example. Another great one, Explosive Prodigy. This is the 1 in a red Vivid card. It's a 1/1 elemental, comes in, deals X damage to target creature, where X is your Vivid count. When you're at all in the Vivid space, the card Foraging Wickermaw is great. One of the 2 drops you're looking for. This is the 2 mana artifact creature. It's a 1/3. When it enters, surveil 1. You can pay 1, filter a mana, add a mana of any color, and this creature becomes that color until end of turn. So, you know, easy to see where this fits in. It spots you whatever colors you're missing for your Vivid cards, or it casts your Vivid cards. Also, kind of a interesting, funky little quirk with this card. So, say you have plains and mountains in play with this card, right? You don't have any blue mana. Why am I saying blue mana? Well, you can actually cast a blue Convoke card with this card alone, right? This card alone fixes your mana for the common draw spell, for example, right? Because it makes a mana of any color, and it becomes that color, which then you can tap this creature for. So, hasn't come up very much for me. I also don't think you should build your deck in a way where you're just relying on the Wickermaw to cast your Convoke card. That's not a good way to build your deck. But in-game, it's something that might not be obvious when you're just looking at your board, right? So just be aware of that. An underrated card for this deck, Flamekin Guildweaver. This is 3 in a red for a 4/3 trample elemental. When it enters, you create a treasure token. And yeah, this card is just good. So on Monday, I went to Mark's place. You know, my set review partner, Mark Anderson, he holds drafts for Pro Tour players, kind of just practice events. And at the end of that event, we had a little bit of a debrief, just talking about the commons in this set and where we like them. And Mark mentioned this card in particular, saying, yeah, this is just a good card. People leave this in their sideboard, they ignore it, they don't draft it. Mark was saying he's looked at some people's decks, I can say this now as well, where, this card's in the sideboard, and there's a lot worse cards in the main deck. Pretty good body, 4 mana, 4/3 trample, is an elemental, gives you a treasure, just not a lot to dislike about this card. And then finally here, a card that I don't know exactly how much I'm a believer in right now, but I want to be a believer in it. So this is Kindle the Inner Flame, 3 and a red for a Kindred Sorcery Elemental. You make a copy of target creature you control, except it gains haste, and at the beginning of the end step, sacrifice this token. It also has flashback for 1 and a red, behold 3 elementals. So the vision here, of course, is on turn 6, you have a sick elemental on the battlefield, right? It could be anything really, but if you have like a vivid payoff with a really good end to the battlefield effect, I think that's probably the best thing. So you copy that, you get the end to the battlefield effect, you now have 2 elementals, you only need 1 more elemental either in your hand or on the battlefield to be able to flash this thing back. And, that's a pretty explosive turn. You're often going to draw a bunch of cards or kill a bunch of things or gain a bunch of life and deal a bunch of damage. And it's got some risk, of course. Like, it's a card that needs some setup. It's a card that can get blown out. Your opponent can just cast a removal spell in response. You're very sad. But it's also a card with a really high ceiling. So I'm interested in this. I'm especially interested in it if maybe I have ways to discard this card. So I can just get a little bit of value just casting the flashback on a later date. And we've got Tweeze, the red removal spell that deals 3. And you discard a card, you can draw a card. We've also got Flaring Cinder, which is the elemental hybrid card at common. The one, is it 3/2? When it enters or you cast a spell mana value 4 or greater, you can discard a card if you do draw a card. Really like this card, by the way. It does a very good job of filtering you, finding the things you need. One of the things Red Blue is very good at is finding the cards it needs, right? It's got a lot of filtering, it's got a lot of rummaging, a lot of looting, a lot of card draw. That's another reason it ties in nicely with the Vivid stuff, because when you're splashing, it's really good to have card selection to be able to find your sources and the cards you're splashing. So yeah, all in all, Elemental's a pretty complex deck. I imagine this is going to be one where I deep dive on a later week on the format, really get into the nitty-gritty, really get into, some corner cases, stuff like that, because it's a really fun deck, a little bit difficult to piece together, though. And then we've got the last creature-type deck, and that is Black-Red Goblins. So, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go too deep on this one. Often, on week 1 of the format, state of the format address, I like to just get to you like, hey, here are the good decks, draft these are the safe decks. The other parts of the format we'll figure out, we'll optimize on later. So, again, not going to go super deep. I also will say I don't have as much experience with the Goblin deck as I do with the other decks. I actually haven't drafted this one myself. I've done like co-op drafts with people where we've drafted Goblins. There's also a bunch of people in my Discord who are staunch Goblin believers, like to the point of soft forcing it. Yeah, so the idea with this deck is you're just like nickel and diming the opponent, pinging them out. The gold card, Boggart Curse Crafter, is the red-black 2/3 Death Touch Goblin. Whenever another goblin you control dies, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. We've also got Boggart Mischief, which is the 3-mana black Kindred enchantment. When it enters, you can blight 1. If you do, you make 2 goblin tokens, and it also says, whenever a goblin you control dies, each opponent loses life, you gain a life. There's also something kind of interesting going on with the card Lasting Tarfire. 1 and a red for an enchantment. At the beginning of each end step, if you put a counter on a creature this turn, this enchantment deals 2 damage to each opponent. So, yeah, in this deck, you've got quite a few blight cards. A lot of the goblins actually blight themselves. And, you can kind of have an engine here going. The goblins really appreciate the chip damage, just kind of nickel and dime them out. So yeah, you can kind of see what's going on here. Proceed with caution would be my advice though, because if you don't have the Curse Crafters, if you don't have the Mischiefs, your deck's just not really gonna do that much. Like the Goblin deck can put out a bunch of fodder, but these are really the ways that you have to capitalize on that fodder. There's some rares, of course, out there too, but at the non-rare level, this is what you're looking at. And it's not as many payoffs, or just strong payoffs anyways, as the other decks that we talked about, the 4 generically good decks. There's also an aspect here where I think it's pretty difficult to draft. You need the right balance of fodder and blight cards and cards that care about blight. If you're doing the Lasting Tarfire thing, you gotta balance how many blight cards you have. You don't want this card to be a blank. Balancing how many blight cards you have with this card basically means you've got a lot of blight cards, because otherwise it's just terabad. Couple that with the fact that it's not your standard aggro deck, where you're going 2 mana 2/2, 3 mana 3/3, very much in the Kithkin department. This deck's a little bit different. It kind of wants to sell up the game. It kind of wants to accrue value. It doesn't mind if its 2-drop is Gristle Glutton. That's the 1 in a red 1/3 goblin. Tap to blight 1, discard a card if you do draw a card, right? Like, a 1/3 for 2 mana is not good in your typical aggro deck, but this isn't really your typical aggro deck. Anyways, like I said, I think there's something here. I think there's something to explore. Gonna be something I for sure talk about on a later week. But if you haven't been doing well in this format and you've been drafting goblins a lot, well, there might be some correlation there. That's all I'm getting at. And just quickly, if you're enjoying the show, maybe you've been watching for a while, you feel like you've gotten some value out of it, maybe won a few more drafts that you wouldn't have otherwise, go check out the Patreon. Patreon.com/limitedlevelups. That's the #1 place you can go to support me, any of my content. It's how the show keeps running. We have awesome benefits over there. At the lower tiers, you get Discord access to the private channels in the Limited Level Ups Discord. I'm happy to take a look at your final draft deck, see if there's any swaps I would make. At the mid levels, you get full-on deck tech, so in-depth explanation, draft log reviews, either text-based or video. You can find those in the Discord. And then at the higher levels, you get access to private coaching from me and group classes, which are a lot of fun, by the way. We're having one this coming Monday, I believe. Yeah, this coming Monday. Basically, we all get together, somebody screen shares, we talk about the picks, and yeah, it's just a really good time. So if you're interested in any of those benefits, or just supporting the show, link is in the description. Go check it out, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. We're going to wrap today up with a few big picture concepts, some things that I think are really important to keep in mind. I usually talk about this stuff at the beginning of these kind of episodes, but I think it's more useful after we've talked about the main decks. So 3 things I want to talk about here. They're all kind of related, and yes, we will get to draft navigation. That is one of the things. Okay, so first thing to talk about, the rares in this format. This is a format with a lot of very good rares. Luckily, a lot of the rares are the type of rares that if you can answer them with a removal spell, the game goes on, they're not a huge deal. So cards like High Perfect Morcant, that's the black-green elf rare that like blights your opponent's creatures, Spinerock Tyrant, giant dragon that copies spells, Erdu, Carrier of Dawn, that's the Baneslayer, flying lifelinking 5/5. These cards, while very good, and will win the game if they don't go unanswered, also get answered by a removal spell pretty readily. Now, there are some cards that don't fall into this. There are 2 good Planeswalkers in the set, Ajani and Oko. A lot of the removal doesn't hit Planeswalkers. In fact, I think only Seer does. That's the 4 damage for 2 mana spell. There's also Kin Binding at rare, which I think is just like the most egregious card in the set. This is one of those cards you're like, yeah, this should have been a mythic, at least for limited play. This is 3 white for an enchantment. Creatures you control get +X/+X, where X is the number of creatures that enter the battlefield under your control this turn. At the beginning of combat on your turn, create a 1/1 green and white Kithkin token. And yeah, this card is just extremely difficult to beat, and of course does not get killed by a conventional removal spell. So the first thing you want to consider with these rares is you will face them. They're going to be a part of every game. And you know, not just rares, but some of the premium uncommons. So like the Merfolk Lord or the Elf Lord. Cards that you would really like to kill. Cards that if you get rid of those, the rest of their board is kind of manageable. I usually recommend that you have around 6 removal spells in most limited formats recently, and I'm pretty strict about that in this format, because, again, you're just going to face these cards game in, game out, these cards that you must answer. It also means I want to be conservative with the removal spells I have. If you only have 1 more removal spell in your hand, I'm very picky about when I cast that. Kind of a very rough rule of thumb I've developed over the past few days is I won't cast my removal spell unless I can see a clear path to lethal in 2 turns. So what this looks like usually is you go, okay, I only have 1 removal spell in my hand, and, you know, I kind of want to save this for some really good card that might be on the top of their deck, but if you say, okay, I get 1 blocker out of the way, I swing all, maybe I don't kill them this turn, but I can kill them next turn with another big swing, that's worth casting a removal spell. But if there are like 14 and they have like a pretty good but not amazing creature, you know, I'm thinking like the green 4-mana 4/4 elf that is hard to block, can pump itself. I really want to try to deal with that card another way. Try to block it or race them, right? That's the other answer. You don't always have to kill other important things. You could just try to race them, which means that, of course, it's important to be proactive, like I've been talking about. But yeah, too many times I've seen spots where people use their last removal spell in their hand, and then the very next turn, the opponent just plays a game-ending bomb that we would very much have liked to kill. Now, this brings me to another point, which is that to have a good deck in this format often means to have a deck with like 3 or 4 A-level cards, or like B plus A-level cards, something around there. That could mean rares, that could also mean those premium uncommons that I've talked about. You know, like all episode I've been going like, yeah, this is basically as good as a rare, like the Eclipse cards and the gold cards at uncommon. Big overarching thought for how to draft a good deck in this format is high rarity cards. And that's either opening good cards and trying to draft around them, trying to kind of bully yourself into a lane where you can play those cards, or maybe splash them. Or B, if you don't open those awesome cards, then you want to leave yourself open to getting past them. You know, the cards that people are putting down. You're picking up what other people are putting down. A very core tenet of draft, I know. It's nothing revolutionary. But I think you feel it so much more in this format than you might in some other format, because the average deck, you know, the average deck that people are going to draft is going to have a good rare or two, maybe 2 or 3 rares. And if you're below that number, you've got a below average deck. And this brings me to my second big picture point, which is, when do you draft the off-brand decks? Why would you want to draft the off-brand decks, which are white-black, red-white, blue-green, red-green, and blue-black? When do you draft those decks? I think the answer is largely when you have rares in those colors, because the synergies in these decks, black-white and red-white, have like the -1/-1 counter theme. It's pretty light. There's not like a whole deck you can build around it, really. At least not that I've encountered. The vivid stuff, you know, that's totally doable in blue-red. You don't need to be base blue-green or base red-green. You actually get fewer strong cards, I think, if those are your bases. There's the blue-black theme of casting cards on your opponent's turn. Also, extremely light fairy theme. So there's not really reasons to go into those colors, those color pairs, other than, hey, I'm just getting a lot of powerful cards of those colors. One of my trophies here, this deck in front of me, is kind of exactly that. This is a white-black deck that doesn't have actually a ton of synergy. It just kind of has a lot of powerful cards. So I started off the draft with Erdu, Carrier of Dawn. This is the 3 white 5/5 mythic flying lifelink that you do want actually black mana for this, because you have to pay black to transform to the backside. So that was a little bit of a push to say, okay, I'm going to be black-white. But I also got past some pretty good black cards in general. I've got Taster of Wares, which is the goblin rare that like thought seizes your opponent. I've got Shadow Urchin, which is the red-black hybrid rare that like draws cards. And so I've just got some pretty decent black cards in here. I started this draft off very white, and then pack 2 or pack 3, I actually don't remember which one, I got past a bunch of black cards. I never really found that Merfolk was open in this draft. I didn't really feel that Kithkin was very open in this draft, and so I said, hey, this is where the power lies. Now, I do think there's something to be said, probably not today, but something to be said about the hybrid uncommons of the off-brand decks. So there's like the Tree Folk, the black-white Tree Folk. That card's pretty strong. There's the Fairy that draws cards when you cast cards under your opponent's turn. I actually had that card in a close to mono blue-white deck, where I had a lot of instants. So I was playing that card there. Anyways, there's something to be said about those cards in the main decks, right? In the main 5 creature decks, if you're heavy enough slanted towards one color, which I think is a good idea to be able to do, by the way, if you can, because then you get to play more of the hybrid cards, right? If you're very heavy white, you can play both Eclipse Kithkin and Eclipse Marrow, and, sure, you're not going to have a giant density of both these creature types, but even if they just grab lands and a changeling or something once in a while, they're still going to be really good cards. So yeah, probably a little bit of an area of the format to explore another day. Long story short, though, about these off-brand decks, I think you're most often going to want to go into them when those are just the open colors and you get rares of those colors. And don't be afraid to, because, again, big, overarching, big picture, your goal for this format, I think, is to end up with 3 or 4 rares or rare level uncommons. You'll hear people say, find the open lane, find the open creature type deck. That is sometimes good. That is going to get you to that goal a lot of the time, right? Because the open lane will mean you get past good rares sometimes. Not always, though, right? And if there's another lane that is presenting those rares, I would prefer to be in that lane rather than the open Merfolk deck, right? The quote-unquote open Merfolk deck that doesn't actually have any premium cards. And so with all that in mind, we can kind of wrap it all into a nice little package as we're talking about draft navigation. Because yeah, draft navigation, pretty difficult in this format. There's an impulse, certainly, to say, hey, I've started with a great elf rare, let's just use elves for an example, and I second picked, pretty good elf uncommon, maybe not one of the premium ones, not the Eclipse card, not the gold card, but a pretty good one, into, okay, a pack with some medium elves, maybe I take one, but then pick 4 there's a really great Merfolk card, maybe even the gold card, right? The blue-white gold card. What are you supposed to do there? So I think the best way to train wreck in this format is to first pick a good rare of one of the creature type decks and then never look back. I do think it's really important to stay open to getting past powerful cards. You want to find the right lane so you can get past good cards later, but here's the catch. If you've already started with multiple great cards of a certain deck, and when I say multiple, I mean like you've gotten to your 3 by the start of pack 1. Because remember, the overall goal, maybe I should have said this a second ago, but the overall goal when you're talking about draft navigation is to end up with 3 or 4 awesome rares or uncommons. And if you've gone awesome elf rare into awesome elf rare into awesome elf uncommon, you're kind of there on power level already. And so I'm not going to want to move off of that unless there's something overwhelming coming my way. It's just like, wow, every single Merfolk card is still in the pack, like pick 8 or something, including some really awesome uncommons. Clearly nobody's touching this. Maybe I should pivot. But if you're not getting that giant push and you've started with great cards, you've kind of already won, right? You've started with those great cards. So I'll give you a little bit of an example draft here. This is a draft that somebody sent to me for a draft log review. We're starting with Gloom Ripper, one of the best cards in the set. This is the 3 black 4/4 elf. When it enters, target creature you control gets +X/+0 until end of turn, and up to 1 target creature an opponent controls gets -0, -X until end of turn, where X is the number of elf cards you control plus number of elf cards in your graveyard. It's a Chupacabra that deals a bunch of damage when it comes in. Fantastic card. We then go to a pack with Champion of the Perfect. So this is the 3 and a green 6/6 elf. As an initial cost, you have to hold an elf card and exile it. Whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card, and then, you know, it's got the text that all these cards have. When this creature leaves, you get back the exiled card. So we've already started with like an A+ bomb, and I would say like an A- bomb. Okay, so I'm already almost there for my elf deck to be like, yeah, I'm just going to take elves from now on and basically carve out my lane, put the blinders on. The next few picks, we get a Mutable Explorer, which is another solid rare. You know, it's a shapeshifter rare, so doesn't go any particular deck. We then take a Changeling Wayfinder, so another shapeshifter. And then it does seem like black-green not all that open. I mean, we get a Blightrot pick 5. Once we get to pick 6, we have a Stoic Grove Guide. That's the 5-mana 5/4 that you can exile from your grave to make a 2/2 token. The person chose to take a Crossroads Watcher, for what it's worth, which is the 3-mana Kithkin that has trample and gets +1/+1 when a creature enters. I would have taken the elf here because you have 2 excellent elf cards, right? So you want to keep on going down that path. This pick's a pretty good example of what I was talking about earlier, where sometimes you will take a worse card, quote unquote, a less powerful card in a vacuum because it has the creature type you care about. And then the story of this draft as it goes on is black-green is not all that open. We don't see awesome black-green cards. We also see like some pretty solid blue-white cards around pick 7. But there is a playable card in this pack for a Shadow Urchin. That's the hybrid Rakdos rare. We get a Shimmer Creep pick 8. That's the vivid black card. And then the rest of the pack doesn't really give us much. But I think you could easily look at this first pack and go, oh, I'm not supposed to be elves, right? I just like... Elves isn't super open, blue-white seems to be kind of open. I think that's the wrong approach though. Because you've already got those 2 excellent elf rares, and now mind you, I've been saying 3 is the number of awesome cards you want to have before you say, okay, I'm locking into this deck. But Gloom Ripper being as good as it is, it almost counts as like 2.5 for me, right? If there weren't options in the packs for the elf deck, if there was literally not a card you could take for all the end of pack 1 there, I'd say, you know what, it is closed off enough that you shouldn't draft this deck. But since there were reasonable options, and you've already locked in the power, I think it's right to keep going down the elf path here. Now, let's rewind this draft and say that it went a little bit differently. We do get to first pick that Gloom Ripper, like we do in the actual draft, but let's say the next pick wasn't an elf rare, right? And then the pick after that, there was a good Merfolk card. And the pick after that, maybe a good Merfolk card and a good elf rare. You kind of have to, it's a bit of a toss-up there. And you're still going to try to want to read what's open if you haven't already locked in that 2 to 3 awesome rares. And that's the situation where I'm very willing to feel out the draft, see what's open. Even though Gloom Ripper is excellent and it really wants to have a lot of elves, I want to play this card. I really do. But if this is your only excellent elf card in your elf deck, I don't think that's good enough. So I'm staying open to staying open. Yeah, that's kind of a funny way to put it. I'm staying open to staying open until I've got my 3 excellent cards. Once I've got my 3 excellent cards that go in the same deck, I'll probably lock in at that point. Now, that of course isn't the entire story. Draft navigation is very complex, and I could have a full episode about that. But I think if you take anything away from this episode and how to think about navigating the drafts, I think it's that. I think it's that your goal is to get to those 3 awesome, excellent cards, either great rares or great uncommons. That's your lock-in point. Anything before that, I'm still open to pivoting into a different color, maybe pivoting into 2 different colors if I think that's right to do. You can also kind of get trapped the other way, where you start drafting a deck. Maybe you didn't start with rares, but you figure it's the open lane. Let's just say it's Merfolk. I'll actually give an example from a coaching session I had earlier. We were in blue-white Merfolk for most of the draft. So pack 1, pack 2. Heavy blue Merfolk, for what it's worth. But I think we only had 1 rare. It was a generically good blue rare. I don't remember what it was. It wasn't specific to Merfolk. We picked up some pretty solid white cards, and Merfolk did seem to be open. But by the time we got to pack 3, we still only had that 1 rare. And our opening pack, pack 3, had a Silver Gill Mentor. That's the 2-mana Merfolk that you have to behold, and when it enters, you make a 1/1 token, so a very good Merfolk card. But there was also a Vibrance. That's the Gruul Elemental with Evoke. Comes in, if you've paid red, it deals 3 damage to something. If you pay green, you go get a basic land and you gain 2 life. Excellent card, right? Even if you're just casting it for red. And so you're drafting Merfolk up until pack 3, and you're like, oh, great, I opened a Silver Gill Mentor. That's a pretty good Merfolk card. But I kind of went, I think it's just better to take Vibrance here, because we don't have that many white cards. We don't have that much power. We can just pivot into blue-red, take Vibrance, pick up some good blue cards. Maybe, if you do see some good red cards this pack, great. But I'm willing to give up our 6 white cards to be able to play Vibrance, right? I mean, there certainly comes a point where it's like, okay, I have 7 white cards or 8 white cards. I can't give up all these playables in pack 3. But if you're already close to making playables, it's definitely worth taking a risk on the Vibrance, even if it doesn't pan out. And so that's why this format's really tricky to navigate. You want to stay flexible to pick up those kind of cards later, but you also want to recognize when it's right to lock in because you've already got the power. In any case, I can't say that this is the perfect solution for drafting this format. We're only a week in. I'm sure my approach is going to change a little bit, but I think it's a useful way to think about things, right? At least incorporating some of these ideas into how you're drafting. And that's going to do it for our Lorwyn State of the Format Address episode. Thanks so much for watching and listening, everybody. If you made it this far, do consider checking out the Patreon or just giving the video a like, a comment, and subscribe. All that stuff's great. If you're planning to play in the Lorwyn Spotlight event in Toronto in 2 weeks, or you're just playing in any PTQs, any sealed format events, I'm going to be posting a special sealed episode next week. We're going to have our normal Friday episode just talking about the draft format, but I'm also going to have an extra thing, a seal guide come in. So look forward to that if you're all interested in some sealed thoughts. And yeah, we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.